Welcome back. Today on World Hunger Day, we turn our attention to a stark reality that shadows our nation despite the progressive guarantees enshrined in our Constitution, the right to food and basic nutrition. Millions of fellow citizens continue to grapple with the daily burden of chronic and acute hunger. This deeply concerning disconnect between legal promise and the lived deprivation is a central focus of the organization, the Union Against Hunger. Let's now bring in Dr. Busiso Moyo, who is from the Union Against Hunger, to understand their vital work and enabling supporting communities to demand their fundamental right to food. A very good morning to you, Dr. Moyo. Thank you so much for making time for us. Just as an opening question, do you believe that South Africa has a food crisis?
Good morning, Aldrin, and good morning to your viewers. Simple answer, yes. Just this morning, News 24 headlines are speaking to the fact that at least 25% of South Africans are now considered hungry. And what is more distressing and more alarming is that the reports also speak to the fact that a fifth of kids in South Africa do not live with their parents. And once again, when we're talking about food insecurity, this is about household food security dynamics. So the situation facing our country is very, very dire, and it's very, very grave. We have a seriously food insecure population.
Yeah, and what would we say is at the core of the reason why we have that food insecurity, specifically now focusing on South Africa?
Yeah, well, look, South Africa presents a very unique case, and I would be lying if I was to say I've got all the answers. So we cannot be given to easy analysis, but contextually, we need to foreground the fact that ours is a context of the highest inequality in the world. So in a context of joblessness, landlessness, and thus inequality context, what type of food system is anchoring the population? So for us as the Union Against Hunger, it's about, driving this human rights ethic that's going to shift us towards a nourishing food system for all. And in essence, we do not have the answers to these very complicated and wicked problems. But what we are saying is that it's high time we start advocating and militating and agitating around the statecraft, right, that is producing hunger. So we want to speak to this idea of hunger as state failure. That's what we're getting at with the Union Against Hunger. And I think it's befitting that on a day like this, that is World Hunger Day, that we try and bring the South African population closer to this issue.
Yeah, so we have policy interventions, at least when we look at our social welfare policy in the country. You have the child support grant, for instance, that we have, which we also understand is way below the poverty line. But then on the other end as well, you have other initiatives like a food bank and so forth. But what's evident is that not even that is enough. We just showed a graphic now of 11,000 children die due to malnutrition every year. And then on top of that as well, we look at the stunting conversation. And for me, the stunting one, very important, because if there is no intervention at that infant level, the impact that has on the child's brain development and long into their adulthood, the impact that then has on their ability to even create a living for their own, for themselves.
Yeah, no, indeed, Mr. Aldrin. And I think, look, what we're getting at is when we look at the social security context in South Africa, it's quite credible. But what we are dealing with here are these, social pockets of hunger within the social safety net situation that we have in South Africa. So now we've had the social relief of distress grant that has now come in, has become a permanent fixture in terms of that social security package. And that is something that is commendable, right, on the part of government to say at least, something that came in as a stop-start measure during COVID has come in and has come in to stay. But also what is very encouraging at this moment in time time is this particular focus, right, from a fiscal lens when we are looking at the ECD sector, the early childhood development sector. And we are hoping that, in terms of this kind of shift that we're experiencing with the state-crafted play, that will then translate to some kind of dividends, right, especially when we look at the best interest of the child. And also remember, right, if we're talking about infants and their rights to basic nutrition, we also need to foreground, maternal support in this, supporting breastfeeding, supporting pregnant women, because ultimately, right, like you rightfully say, it all speaks to those developmental years, those first 1,000 days, those first 5 years, especially when we zone in on the status of children. So all of this, is us saying, look, we are looking to engage the statecraft at play, but because food systems transformation, this idea of ensuring that a nourishing food system is within reach for everybody is a bit complicated. Why? Because at the end of the day, government also does not produce food. So this is also a question of, business and human rights. What is the constitutional fidelity of corporate actors in carrying this burden together with, the state? And as for us as activists and academics, we are coming in to say, look, let's then, in the midst of this kind of paralysis, let's flesh out, this issue of hunger as a standalone issue, because what is currently happening in South Africa at the moment is that the issue of hunger is a crime and we are murdering our children.
Yeah, you mentioned the SRD grant, and I remember when it was first introduced, one of the criteria was that the individual who would qualify must not be receiving any other grant. But sadly, what that meant as well was that women who take care of children who do receive grants, they were then also thrown into that category of people that are receiving grants, when in actual fact the grant is actually intended for the child. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is around the gendered access to food. If we look at the general household survey that was released yesterday, 42.4% of households are led or headed by women. And if you look at our unemployment stats tell us that women bear the biggest brunt when it comes to unemployment. And on top of that as well, 45.5% of children in this country currently live with only their mothers. So it speaks again to me around the desperation that women find themselves in, specifically when we look at a racialized point of view, is the black woman and what the black woman, the black mother, finds herself in.
So there you have it, Mr. Aldrin. You've hit it right spot on. What is the face of food insecurity in South Africa? It is a black rural woman in particular, because sometimes in this country we have an obsession, right, with urban politics, that we have blind spots to rurality. And what you're raising is very, very profound, Eldrin, because there's also the issue of seasonal hunger. So when we look at our women farm workers who are anchoring this food system and producing the food that we eat, if we look at their food security status, it would be alarming what was going to emerge from there. Our women, our mothers, our sisters, our aunts are going through seasonal hunger on these farms in seasons when they're not employed. And then you want to talk about the administrative bottlenecks that have come with something like the social relief of distress grant, which also has ripple-on effects when we then zone in on that household food security context. So what you're pointing at is absolutely grave, and it's something that we need to treat with a sense of urgency and militancy. I haven't had the opportunity to grapple with the latest GHS survey, but based from what you're saying, it once again makes sense, because it echoes, right, those headline kind of tagline news that I started off with, to say 25% of South Africans are considered hungry. That is 1 in 4. And you speak to the fact that 11,000 children annually die of causes that are preventable. And if we do not intervene at the state, there's going to be ripple-on effects. You're talking about educational outcomes. And this is what we are getting at, to say we need some kind of state leadership that is going to intervene and put some kind of, measures in place to ensure that we carry the burdens of those at the bottom of the pyramid.
Yeah. Tomorrow we're going to have the repo rate that is going to be announced by the Monetary Policy Committee. And one thing that they always emphasize on is administrative cost. And this is now dealing with, for instance, the price of electricity, the price of fuel, which is also determined by government. Then there's a minimum wage as an example. So the minimum wage, a worker earning the national minimum wage after electricity and transport costs can buy less than 41% of the nutritious diet for a family of 4. So even though that you have these policy interventions that are saying that there must be a minimum wage, that money is also then eroded by administrative costs, such as now we're going to, on the 2nd of June, we're going to have an increase in the fuel price as well. Speak to us about when policy makers sit down and discuss the socioeconomic conditions that the majority find themselves in, whether or not they look at the data and what the data tells them about the power of the rand and its value being eroded.
Well, Eldrin, that's a very complicated question because, data is not neutral as well. Whose data are we talking about? Who's providing the evidence base that, informs our understanding of the issue and what is possible. Now, that's a conversation for another day. But ultimately, what we're getting at, I would like to hope that, the government is preoccupied with what a decent standard of living could look like for the populace. And if we are talking about, the food poverty line, if we're talking about a nutritious food basket, and then you anchor that and you juxtapose that to the social security regime, right, in terms of what's available from a social safety net perspective, are we really saying that a South African can be nutritionally sustained and have an adequate diet on 370 rands per month? Let's have a clear, honest discussion about that. Let's talk about the food poverty line. Let's talk about what a basic goods basket looks like and how much does it cost. Because ultimately, this is about what? Purchasing power. And we are saying in a context of joblessness and in a context where we are also grappling, right, with this food, energy, and water crisis, which is also interlinked, then let's start talking about, health and well-being. So when we speak about a nutritionally nourishing diet, perhaps do we need to start speaking about a right to nutrition? Right? Because maybe that is when this message is going to get home. I'm not claiming to have the answers, Aldrin, but I am saying I would hope that the statecraft at play is also sitting and centering this thing as a major, major issue that now needs to form part of the state's agenda setting moving forward.
Yeah, and at a grassroots level, in the absence of the policy decisions and policy makers being able to respond to what is required, as a household, what can we do to play our part to make sure that we're able to deal with this food crisis that we're speaking about?
Yeah, indeed. So first and foremost, I think this is about solidarity. So we need to be very sensitive to those who perhaps might be, at the coalface of hunger. But I think as well, it's about engaging local government, right, to see what local government in particular can do. Because what we're seeing at this moment is that, the local sphere doesn't really have a food security mandate. And I think that is when, the biggest interface with the public lies. So if we can speak about, public food gardening, agroecology methods, if we can talk about food banks, community kitchens, how do we all come together and really ensure that there's some kind of convergence, right? In so far as ensuring that not only the policy cycle speaks to this, but also the issue of food waste, right? So what happens to all this food that is on our shelf lives? Because, best before dates and expiry dates do not necessarily translate to the fact that the food is not good for consumption. So things like that, just to find a point of convergence so that we can ensure that at least we are all singing from the same hymn book in terms of, one, our understanding of this issue, two, the trade-offs that come with it, but more importantly, how every stakeholder within South African society then rings back to this idea of constitutional fidelity, because this right is a codified right in the South African Constitution, and we need to all give prominence to that fact.
Yeah, I wonder whether that conversation would need to be had with the private sector as well, because on the one end, what happened during the July 2021 unrest, what we saw there was an argument from various sectors that if you do just leave the groceries that have been stolen it means that the demand for that groceries or that food items that have been stolen then goes down, which is going to impact which is then going to impact the price and also the supply and demand element around it. What's the conversation that should be had then with the private sector?
Yeah, well, we need to confront the private sector, particularly on that, because I think what underpins that, right, as the economics of scarcity. We need to understand, right, when we're talking about the food value chain, whose value are we talking about? Who determines value in that food value chain? And when we look back to those 2000 and the July riots, it's still inconclusive, but I'm willing to argue that those were food riots. And people were just opportunistic, because ultimately where we saw was that it was the politics of the mall. The uprisings did not take place anywhere else. And, if we interrogate that in particular, we would see that what was underpinning that frustration was once again a context of food insecurity, and people were very opportunistic. But, just to say, you know what I mean, that's just a very opinionated sort of perspective. But to ring back to all of this, what we're saying is, look, in the context of the just transition as well, because now we are talking about a climate that is changing. What we are fearing now is that, there may be triggers within the food system that we will not be able to comprehensively respond to because of this fractured, societal context when it comes to the food security context. So if we have to have, our food system interrupted by flooding or droughts or so forth, what does that then mean for this very same food value chain? And these are the questions we are talking about. To say things are already great at this stage, and we already know the vulnerability that underpins, our climate, the actual food system, and also bearing in mind that South Africa occupies a very interesting space geopolitically in terms of the global food value chain, right? So we need to grapple with all these things and what that then means, for advancing this idea of a nourishing food system.